"Who dropped you home last night?" That was all he said. Kim Tae-chan didn't move from where he stood at the kitchen counter, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. My husband, Seoul's most feared man, the one people crossed entire cities to avoid, was watching me from across 6 feet of cold marble, and his hands were completely still, pressed flat against the countertop, like he was holding something down. And I understood, in the space of one breath, that the most controlled man I had ever known was 3 seconds from losing it entirely. Not over a car ride, over me. And that, loves, is where this story begins. A wife who built walls to survive her own marriage, a husband who has been quietly, completely falling apart over her for 18 months and never said a single word. And one Tuesday night, one ordinary car ride home, that cracks 2 years of silence right down the middle. If you're here for slow burn tension that makes your chest ache, jealous husbands who don't know how to love out loud until it's almost too late, and marriages that fight their way into something real, you are exactly where you need to be. Hit subscribe right now because we have more of these coming. Smash that like button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? Are you team, he had no right to ask, or team, she already knew what that question meant? I need to know. Let's get into it. Helena had been home for exactly 11 minutes when she heard him. She hadn't seen him yet. The penthouse was the way it always was at this hour. Vast, perfectly lit, the kind of silence that cost money. She dropped her bag on the entryway table, stepped out of her heels, pressed her palm against the cool wall the way she always did after a long evening, grounding herself in the familiar geometry of the place before she moved through it. 2 years, and she still did that, still took a moment at the threshold before she walked all the way in. The Arts Foundation opening had run 3 hours longer than scheduled. It was a good evening, her building, her design, and people who understood what they were looking at. She'd been light on the way home, the kind of light you forget you're capable of until it finds you. Daniel had offered the ride when her usual driver hadn't answered. It had taken 40 minutes and an argument about the best radio station in Seoul, and she'd laughed more than she had in weeks. She padded toward the kitchen in socked feet, thinking about tea. He was already there. Kim Tae-chan stood at the island with both hands flat on the marble, still dressed in his suit, jacket on, tie precisely knotted, as if he hadn't moved since a meeting that ended hours ago. He wasn't looking at the door when she walked in. He was looking at the counter, at nothing. Then he looked at her. Helena stopped. She had spent 2 years learning to read this man, the micro shifts in his expression that other people missed entirely, the difference between his silences. She knew the silence that meant he was thinking, the silence that meant a meeting had gone badly, the silence that meant he was waiting for someone else to speak first. This was none of those. This silence had an edge she had never seen before, something controlled and burning at the same time, like a door held shut by one hand against significant pressure. "Who dropped you home last night?" His voice was quiet, not soft, quiet. There is a difference. Soft is gentle. Quiet, from Kim Tae-chan, was the sound of something being very carefully managed. Helena looked at him across the marble counter. Her tea could wait. Helena had 3 rules for surviving her marriage to Kim Tae-chan. She hadn't written them down. She didn't need to. After 2 years inside this penthouse, inside this life, they had become structural, load-bearing walls she'd built so carefully that sometimes she forgot they were walls at all and mistook them for simply the shape of things. Rule 1. Never ask where he goes after midnight. The black SUVs that arrived without announcement, the phone calls he took standing at the window with his back to the room, the men who moved through the penthouse with the particular stillness of people trained to be invisible. None of it was hers to question. She had married into this world with her eyes open. The silence around certain hours was part of the architecture. Rule 2. Never expects what he hasn't offered. Tae-chan was not a cold man, exactly. He was a precise one. He gave what he decided to give. A nod of genuine approval when she presented well, the occasional dry observation that passed for humor if you were paying close enough attention. And Helena had learned, early, that reaching for more than that was a reliable way to feel the distance between them in her chest. She didn't reach. It was cleaner not to. Rule 3. Never let the marriage become more than it was. It had been arranged with the kind of efficiency that powerful families brought to inconvenient necessities. Her family needed stability and soul. His needed the particular legitimacy that came from certain alliances. The paperwork had been clean, the wedding small, the terms unspoken but understood by everyone in the room. She was his wife. She was not, under any circumstances, supposed to become something harder to manage than that. 2 years. She had followed all 3 rules without exception. The penthouse helped. It was the kind of space designed to make coexistence feel like a choice, wide enough that 2 people could inhabit it completely and intersect only when they decided to. Her studio occupied the east wing, his study the west. They shared the kitchen, the living room, and a dinner table at which they sat 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, talking about work and current events and the sort of things that were interesting without being true. She had built a good life inside those limits. Her firm was thriving. Her reputation in Seoul's architecture community was entirely her own. She'd made sure of that, had refused every introduction he'd offered, every shortcut his name could have opened. The work was hers. That mattered. It was enough. It had always been enough. She told herself this sometimes on the subway Sundays, on the way home from a site visit, watching Seoul move past the window. It was enough. The work, the city, the clean, functional shape of what she had here. She was still telling herself this on Tuesday evening when she slid into Daniel's passenger seat, laughing about nothing, and let him drive her home. She wasn't thinking about security cameras. She wasn't thinking about Tae-chan at all. He left the kitchen before she could answer. That was the part she kept returning to, not the question, the exit. One moment he was there, hands flat on the marble, that burning stillness filling the entire room. The next, he had straightened, adjusted his cuffs with the automatic precision of a man whose hands always needed something to do, and walked out. No raised voice, no follow-up, just the soft sound of his study door closing at the end of the hall, and Helena standing alone in the kitchen with the kettle she'd never turned on and a question hanging in the air like smoke. She stood there for a long time. Then she went to bed. She didn't sleep. By morning, 3 things had changed. Her regular driver, Mr. Sung, who had taken her to every site visit and client meeting for 14 months, sent a message at 7:43 saying he'd been reassigned to other duties. A replacement would be arranged. No explanation. By 9, she discovered she could no longer access the building's residential management system from her phone. The app simply returned an error. The account that had worked fine the previous morning now required authorization she apparently no longer had. Small things, precise things, the kind of adjustments that would look like administrative errors to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Helena was always paying attention. She sat at her drafting table and stared at the site plans for a community library in Mapogu without seeing a single line. Her pencil moved, nothing landed. After 40 minutes, she put it down, pressed her fingers against her eyes, and tried to locate the specific quality of his voice from the night before. Tried to decide whether it had been anger. It hadn't been anger. She knew what anger sounded like, had heard it occasionally from men in his world during meetings she wasn't meant to observe. This had been something else, quieter, more interior. The sound of a man asking a question he had already decided he knew the answer to, which was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. At noon, she picked up her phone and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, cheerful and slightly breathless. He was always moving, always 3 places at once. She told him, in brief, careful sentences, that her husband had asked about the car ride, that things felt strange, that she wanted him to be aware. Daniel was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he laughed. Not unkindly, the laugh of someone who has just been handed information that doesn't fit the picture he's been given. "Helena," he said, still smiling, she could hear it, "I spent the whole drive telling you about Priya's mother and the seating chart disaster. I'm picking out a wedding gift this weekend. Does he know I'm engaged to your cousin?" She hadn't told him. She realized, sitting at her drafting table with soul spread gray and bright beyond the window, that there were quite a few things she hadn't told her husband. The silence between them had always felt mutual. She was beginning to wonder whose it actually was. She told herself she wasn't thinking about him. She was, of course, thinking about him entirely. She sat at her drafting table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and let herself do the thing she had spent 2 years refusing to do. She went back through all of it, carefully. The way she walked a completed building before handover, checking every room for what had been missed, what the blueprints hadn't captured, what only proximity revealed. The tea at 1 a.m, that was the first thing she landed on. She'd come out of her studio late, 3 months into the marriage, unable to sleep after a difficult client call, and found him standing at the kitchen counter in the dark. Not working, just standing, holding a cup of something, looking out at the city. He hadn't heard her. She'd watched him for a moment, this man who moved through every room like he owned the air in it, standing alone at 1 a.m, looking like someone who didn't quite know what to do with the quiet, and then retreated without a word. She'd filed it away and refused to examine it. She examined it now. The site models. 8 months ago, she'd left 3 unfinished maquettes on the dining table. Wrong room, she'd known it, but her studio was full and she'd needed the surface. She came home 2 days later to find them moved. Not removed, moved. To the long windowsill in the east corridor where the afternoon light came in at exactly the angle she needed to see the shadow lines properly. Someone had understood what she was looking at, had understood it well enough to know where the light should come from. Tae-chan had never mentioned it. The concert, a colleague's last-minute cancellation, a ticket she'd almost let go to waste. Tae-chan had appeared at her studio door that evening in his coat, no explanation offered, and ridden with her in complete silence for 40 minutes each way, sitting through 2 hours of contemporary classical music with the focused stillness he brought to everything. Afterward, walking back to the car, he'd said, the third movement was the strongest. Nothing else. She'd been too startled to respond. She'd thought about that sentence more times than she would ever admit. The client, a meeting 14 months ago, a man who had looked at her across the table like her opinion was a pleasantry to be tolerated. She'd handled it. She always handled it. A week later, without discussion or announcement, that firm's contract with Kim Group had quietly ceased to exist. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just the absence of the problem. Helena sat very still with her cold tea. She was an architect. She understood that a building revealed its true structure not in the grand gestures, but in the details, where the weight actually rested, what was holding what up. She had been cataloging this man for 2 years and calling it nothing. It was not nothing. She had known that for a long time. She arrived on a Thursday. Helena noticed her first from across the lobby, which was, she suspected, precisely the intended effect. The woman moved through the building's entrance with the particular ease of someone who had never once in her life felt the need to establish that she belonged somewhere. She simply belonged. It radiated off her the way heat radiated off sun-warmed stone. Her name was Seo Yan. She was introduced, briefly and without ceremony, as a business consultant brought in to advise on the Kim Group's restructuring. Tae-chan made the introduction himself, his voice carrying the same measured neutrality he brought to everything. Seo Yan smiled at Helena, warm, polished, the smile of a woman who had never had cause to be insecure, and said it was lovely to finally meet her. Finally, as if she had heard about Helena, as if she and Tae-chan had spoken about her before this moment. Helena smiled back, said the right things, shook her hand. Then she went to her studio and stood at the window for a long time. The 4 days that followed were the slowest of Helena's marriage. Seo Yan moved through their shared worlds with a fluency that Helena had spent 2 years carefully building and still didn't fully possess. She knew which of Tai-chan's staff to speak to and which to leave alone. She knew how he took his coffee. She arrived for meetings already knowing the names in the room. When she spoke, Tai-chan listened with the complete, undivided attention he gave to very few things, and he never once looked across the table to see how Helena was taking it. He had always been good at not looking at her when he decided not to. Thursday evening, a dinner. Helena sat 3 seats away and watched Seo Yan lean slightly forward to say something low and private that made Tai-chan's expression shift. Not much, but enough. A fractional ease, the almost smile he kept for moments he didn't realize were being observed. Helena had cataloged that expression without meaning to, had been quietly, privately collecting it for months. Seeing it directed somewhere else felt like a structural failure, something load-bearing, giving way. Friday, Saturday, the private meetings that ran long, the coffee that arrived correctly, the small, fluent exchanges in the hallway that stopped when Helena rounded a corner and resumed after she passed. By Sunday evening, Helena was not hurt. Hurt was too simple, too clean a word for it. She was jealous. The recognition arrived without drama, which was somehow worse. Just a quiet internal acknowledgement, sitting alone in her studio with her drafts untouched before her. She was jealous of the ease, of the fluency, of the particular way Seo Yan occupied space in Tai-chan's world without appearing to have worked for it at all, which meant Helena had been working for it, which meant it mattered to her. She pressed her palms flat against the drafting table, breathed, looked at Seoul beyond the glass, indifferent and glittering, offering nothing. She had not, as it turned out, been indifferent at all. She thought about leaving on a Monday. Not dramatically. That wasn't how Helena approached problems. And leaving, even now, even this, was a problem to be approached rather than a feeling to be surrendered to. She sat at her drafting table in the early morning before Tai-chan was awake and thought about it practically. What she would need, how long the logistics would take, whether her current projects could be managed remotely from London for a month while she found her footing. She had the professional contacts. She had savings that were entirely her own, had made certain of that from the beginning. She had a cousin in Notting Hill with a spare room and a generous nature. She could leave. The realization that she could leave had always been the thing that made staying feel like a choice rather than a sentence. She had relied on it before, in difficult months, pulled it out and examined it the way you checked a fire exit, just to confirm it was still there. She examined it now and felt nothing like relief. She called Priya instead. Priya answered with the warm, slightly chaotic energy she brought to everything. There was noise in the background, something about a caterer, and then she heard Helena's silence and went quiet herself. She had always been good at that, at knowing when to stop. Helena told her in careful and abbreviated terms about Seo Yan, about the 4 days, about the specific quality of watching someone move through your life with a fluency you had spent 2 years trying to earn. Priya listened without interrupting. Then she said, gently, the way she said difficult things, "Has it occurred to you that he might be scared? Not cruel, scared." Helena said that was a very generous reading of the situation. Priya said Daniel had been terrified before he proposed, that fear in men who weren't practiced at feeling things looked almost identical to coldness from the outside, that the question was not whether Tai-chan was behaving badly, he clearly was, but what he was behaving badly about. Helena dismissed this, said goodbye, made more tea, then sat with it for 2 days. She went back through the marriage the way she audited a completed build, not looking for what worked, but for what the working things were covering. The concert, the site models in the afternoon light, the client who had disappeared, the tea at 1 a.m, his face turned toward the city, looking like a man with no audience and nothing to perform. She found too many moments, more than she had accumulated consciously, which meant she had been collecting them without deciding to. which meant something she was not yet ready to say aloud. She was not indifferent to him. She had not been indifferent for a long time. She was in love with her own husband, and she had absolutely no idea what to do with that. She knocked once and didn't wait for an answer. Tae-chan looked up from his desk with the controlled expression he kept for interruptions, neutral, patient, faintly expecting something to be required of him. Then he saw it was her. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the set of his jaw. He didn't speak. Helena closed the door behind her. She had decided, walking down the corridor, that she would be calm, precise. She would say what she had come to say the way she presented to difficult clients, clearly, without excess, leaving no room for misinterpretation. She had even rehearsed the opening sentence. She forgot it the moment she saw his face. "Daniel Cho is engaged to my cousin Priya," she said instead. "They've been together for 3 years. He dropped me home because my driver didn't answer and it was nearly midnight and it was a car ride. That's all it was. That's all it has ever been." Tae-chan said nothing. "I need you to acknowledge that you heard me," Helena said. "I heard you." His voice was very quiet. "Good." She held his gaze across the width of the room. "Now tell me about Seo Yan." The silence that followed was the longest she had ever stood inside. She watched him, watched the particular stillness that came over him when he was deciding something, the internal weight shifting she had learned to recognize over 2 years of careful, inadvertent study. "She is my cousin's wife," he said finally. "The consultation is legitimate. She is helping restructure several of our legal frameworks. There is nothing else." Helena absorbed this. "You let me think otherwise." Not a question. "Yes." Deliberately? "Yes." Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, closer to acknowledgement. "You wanted me to feel it." "Feel what?" He stood then, slowly, and moved around the desk the way he moved through every room, with complete awareness of the space he occupied. He stopped several feet from her, close enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. "What I felt," he said, "when I saw that footage, 3 seconds of a man I didn't know walking you to our door." He exhaled. "I have been watching you for 18 months, Helena, learning you, the way you talk to your blueprints when you think no one can hear, the way you press your palm against the wall when you come home, every time, like you're checking whether the building is still solid." His voice dropped. "I moved those models because I knew where the light should fall. I went to that concert because I didn't want you sitting alone for 3 hours in a city that still isn't entirely yours. I ended that contract because he spoke to you like you were decorative." Helena couldn't breathe. "I have been afraid of you," Tae-chan said, "since the first month. Not because you're dangerous, because you're real, and I don't know what to do with something real." "The tea," Helena said quietly. 1 in the morning, the kitchen." He waited. "I saw you. I never said anything." Her voice was steady, barely. "The concert, the models, I cataloged all of it and refused to understand what I was cataloging." She took 1 step toward him. "I'm in love with you. I have been for a long time, and I have been furious about it because you never gave me anything to do with it." The silence between them changed. He crossed the remaining distance and kissed her, not desperately, not with the urgency of something finally breaking, but with the certainty of something that had always been true and was only now being said aloud. It was, Helena thought distantly, the most honest thing that had happened in 2 years. The jjigae was terrible. Helena sat at the kitchen island on a Saturday morning and watched Tae-chan serve it to her with complete seriousness, ladling it into the bowl with the focused precision he brought to everything, setting it down before her, straightening, waiting, like a man who had prepared a quarterly report and was confident in his methodology despite all evidence to the contrary. She took 1 spoon, said nothing. He watched her. "It's good," she said. "You're lying." "I'm being diplomatic." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost smile she had been quietly collecting for 2 years, now directed at her, close enough to touch. She felt it land differently than she expected, warmer, less guarded, like a room with the windows finally opened. She ate the entire bowl. 6 weeks of a marriage becoming real felt, from the inside, less like transformation and more like excavation. They weren't building something new. They were uncovering what had been there, under 2 years of careful management, waiting for someone to decide it was worth the work. He read her journals, architecture theory, structural engineering, the dense academic texts she kept stacked on her side of the bed. She noticed the first time. A volume moved, a bookmark she hadn't placed, and said nothing, watching to see if it continued. It did. After 2 weeks, she left one open to a chapter she was working through, a difficult argument about load distribution in cantilever structures, curious whether he would engage. He left a note inside the cover. 3 lines, precise and entirely correct, that reframed the problem in a way she hadn't considered. She read it 4 times. She began asking him, carefully at first, and then less carefully, about the parts of his work she had spent 2 years not asking about. He answered with the same directness he brought to everything. No performance of openness, no careful editing, just the actual truth of how his world functioned, what it had cost, what he was quietly trying to change. She understood, gradually, that the legal restructuring Seo Yan was consulting on was not incidental. He had been working towards something cleaner for over a year, something that could stand in daylight, something she could be part of without compromise. She met his people, not the polished faces from the social world, the real ones, the men and women who had been with him for decades. They looked at her with an attention she didn't expect, not assessment, something closer to relief. She understood it later, turning it over quietly while Tae-chan slept beside her. They had been watching him be alone for a long time. One evening, without preamble, he told her about his father, not the myth she'd inherited with the name, the man, the night Oh Sung-jin's people came, what it had looked like, what it had left behind. Helena listened and didn't look away. Afterward, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said they'd been invited to the Kim Group annual gala, and he wanted them to attend together. Really together. Publicly and without ambiguity, for the first time. She said yes. That evening, she came home to find a security detail she didn't recognize and an envelope on her drafting table she hadn't put there. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper. She recognized it immediately. It was one of her own drawings, a floor plan of the penthouse rendered in her hand, the kind of preliminary sketch she produced early in a project before the technical documentation took over. She didn't remember printing it. She didn't remember it leaving her studio. Someone had taken it or reproduced it precisely enough that the difference didn't matter, and in the center of the page, her studio was circled in red. Nothing written, no signature, just the circle, deliberate and exact, the way you marked a problem on a drawing for correction. Her hands were steady when she brought it to him. She had made them steady. Tae-chan looked at it for a long moment without touching it. When he looked up, she saw something she had never seen on his face before. Not anger. She knew his anger now, knew it was cold and quiet and efficient. This was different. This was fear, carefully contained, and the sight of it frightened her more than the blueprint had. "Oh, Sung-jin," she said. "Yes. He knows about me. He has known about you for some time." His voice was controlled. I had hoped the restructuring would move faster than his attention. It didn't. She waited. "You're going to tell me to leave. London, my cousin's spare room, administrative distance. I'm going to tell you it isn't safe. I'm not leaving, Tae-chan." The argument that followed was the first real one of their marriage, not the cold silences of the previous 2 years, not the careful non-confrontations, an actual argument with raised voices and things said that required the other person to respond to them. She told him she would not be relocated like an asset, that she had not spent 2 years building a life in this city to be managed out of it the moment it became inconvenient, that she understood the risk and was choosing to stay anyway, which was a different thing entirely from not understanding it. He told her Oh Sung-jin had killed his father in their own garden, that he had spent 15 years ensuring no one he cared about became a point of leverage, that she had undone 15 years of that in 6 weeks without even trying. The silence after that was different from all the others. "Then I am not your weakness," Helena said. "I am the reason you win this. Let me stand with you." He looked at her for a long time. Then he told her everything. The gala was held in a building she had designed 3 years before she ever met him. She wore deep burgundy. He adjusted her wrap in the car without being asked, his hands careful, and didn't move his hand from the small of her back from the moment they walked through the entrance. When the introductions came, he didn't say, "my wife." He said, "Helena Kim, the architect who designed this building and the person this family is built around." The room shifted. She felt it. Somewhere across the city, quietly and without public announcement, Oh Sung-jin's network began to come apart at its foundations. Tae-chan's people were very thorough. The message required no translation. She was not a vulnerability. She was the most protected person in Seoul. He asked her in the kitchen. She would think about that later, the fact that he had chosen the kitchen of all places. The same marble counter, the same morning light coming through the east-facing windows, the same geometry of the room where everything had cracked open 4 months ago. Whether he had chosen it deliberately, she never asked. With Tae-chan, deliberate and instinctive had always been difficult to distinguish. He understood spaces. He understood what they carried. She had come down for coffee. He was already there, which no longer surprised her. What surprised her was that he wasn't moving. Hands still, that particular quality of stillness she had learned over the course of one marriage and several lifetimes compressed into 4 months, meant he was holding something down. She stopped in the doorway. He turned and she saw his hands were not empty. The ring was simple, a narrow band of dark metal set with a single stone, worn smooth at the edges in the way of something very old and very handled. She learned later it had belonged to his grandmother, then his mother, then a drawer in his study for 11 years because there had been no one he trusted with it. He hadn't knelt, that wasn't Tae-chan. He stood at the counter where he had once asked her a question that broke 2 years of silence open, and he held the ring, and he looked at her with the expression she had spent 2 years cataloging without understanding, unguarded, unperformed, completely real. "Stay," he said. "Not in the penthouse, in my life, all of it, with everything that means. I have been carrying this for 6 weeks because I kept waiting for the right moment, and then I understood there isn't one. There's only a real one." Helena crossed the kitchen and said yes before he had finished the sentence. The wedding was small, Korean and British customs woven together with the slightly chaotic warmth of 2 families who had initially regarded each other with polite suspicion and discovered over the course of a single weekend that they were more similar than convenient. Priya was maid of honor. Daniel's speech was so embarrassing that Helena covered her face for most of it, and Tae-chan laughed, really laughed, the full version, the one she had been quietly collecting, 3 separate times. She told him about the pregnancy with the blueprint, a 3-bedroom floor plan left on his desk while he was in a meeting, one room labeled in her handwriting, "not yet decided." He came to find her immediately. She heard him coming down the corridor faster than she had ever heard him move. Their daughter arrived on a wet Tuesday in March. He named her Soo-in, someone to trust. 3 years later, Helena sat in bed with the morning coming through the east windows and reached for her architecture journal. It was on his side. It was always on his side now. He had been working through her entire library with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything he decided mattered. He was already awake beside her, reading. He handed it over without looking up, his other hand finding her waist with the ease of something completely habitual, completely chosen. Seoul outside, Soo-in asleep in the next room. The question that had started everything finally answered, not in words, but in this, the ordinary, particular, irreplaceable shape of a life they had built toward each other. She leaned into him and stayed. And that is where we leave them. Helena and Tae-chan. A kitchen. A question. Two people who came together by arrangement and chose each other in the end by something far more difficult than convenience. By honesty, by patience, by the particular courage it takes to stop managing your feelings and start living inside them. He never learned to make the jjigae properly. She never stopped humming off key over her drafts. Soo-lin grew up in a penthouse full of architecture journals and a father who left notes inside the covers, and a mother who pressed her palm against every wall she entered, checking whether the building was still solid. It always was, because the most dangerous man in Seoul had spent 3 years making sure of it, not with fear, not with force, but with the quiet, thorough, completely unglamorous work of learning one person so well that her absence would have been a structural failure, the kind you don't recover from. And Helena, who had built walls strong enough to survive a marriage, had done something braver than any of it. She had walked into his study on a Tuesday, closed the door, and told the truth. That was all it took. That was everything it took. If this story found something in you, the slow burn, the silence that finally breaks, the love that has to fight its way out of two people who are both too proud and too scared to reach first, then you are exactly the kind of person I make these for. Hit that subscribe button right now because we have so many more of these coming. Jealous husbands who don't know how to say it until it is almost too late, wives who are done being handled, arranged marriages that become the realest thing either person has ever chosen, love stories that earn every single moment of themselves. Smash that like button. It tells me this one landed, and it means more than you know. And drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you are watching from right now. Are you in bed with your phone under the covers, commuting somewhere beautiful or somewhere terrible, sitting at a desk pretending to work? I want to know every single one of you, and I read every comment. One more thing before you go. Tell me this. Are you a Helena, someone who built walls so good you forgot they were walls? Or are you a Tae-chan, quietly learning someone from a distance, hoping they'll eventually understand what all that noticing means? Drop it in the comments. I'll be there. I'll see you in the next one.